Okay, we are live. So, welcome back to Perspectives to our followers. Thank you for tuning in, and to our new listeners, welcome. To give a little bit of background on Perspectives, which myself, Jocelyn, and my boss, John, we talk about different human resources and industrial relations topics within the workplace from a millennial and a boomer point of view. So we discussed kind of hot topics that are going on in the world as it relates to human resources like human rights and employment, harassment in the workplace, terminations, labor relations, unions, unionization. But today we're going to take a little bit of a left turn and we're going to talk about the practice of HR and the changing world that we find ourselves amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. So like everybody else in the world, myself and John are working from home and continue to keep up to date with all of these new programs and initiatives that have been put forward. So my first question to John, our boomer, is during your consulting during this time, I know you've been crazy busy during the pandemic. What have you found to be the HR practice that has taken up most of your time?
Thanks, Joss. Thanks for that nice introduction. Um, Without a doubt, it's funny when you look back at the middle of March when all of this really hit home. We were driving back actually from Florida on March the 15th, I believe it was. And it was, I think, on March the 16th when the borders were in fact closing between Canada and the United States. But the entire trip, which we drove back for 2 days, literally was on my part dedicated to talking to all my clients who are very, very ever present in the hotel sector. And each one of them had its own particular story, but the one common theme was we're shutting our hotels down. We're going down to zero occupancy. And it was precipitous. I mean, it was earth shattering. The whole world stopped in the industry itself. So ironically, that was easy. That was easy because everybody went down at the same time. So everybody felt, that they were stabbed in the heart at the same time. What's become more difficult now, of course, is the back and forth, whether you're locked down, you're not locked down, you're open, you're not open. When are we going to see, the full return to what we had as the old normal? And there's so many questions that are occurring. And so as a result of that, it's actually been a little bit more of a challenge in terms of what exactly should we be doing. So as an example, when we're talking about opening a hotel, you're talking about not going to full occupancy. You're talking about if you've got 100 rooms, you might be opening 10 of them, which means you can't recall all of your people back. Then the question is, well, who do you recall back? Or do you recall anyone back for that matter? And so that's taken us into a litany of different pieces of conversation, such as multitasking. So rather than having two people back, you only have one person doing a larger scope of work. And that's been very much a common theme. But now we're looking into November. And November is already, again, a little bit different because now right across this country, what we've discovered is that folks have been either on a temporary leave of absence or they have been on a temporary layoff. But what has now come down to is they're going to have to be converted either into recalls or into permanent layoffs. And this has become actually the biggest issue that I've been dealing with in the recent past is who goes, what do we owe them? Should we use this as an opportunity for doing some performance management? i.e., do you want to keep your superstars and hang on to them as long as you can and get rid of those who have been perhaps not doing as well as you would want them to? Or do you recognize things such as like the service and say, well, loyalty counts here and we're not going to use performance as a criteria, we're going to use service. And so these become some pretty serious discussion points and really, really heart-wrenching because no matter what, somebody's not going to be working. So these have been really a preoccupation, Jocelyn.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine, it's so interesting because it's, two sides of the coin. CEOs or general managers are kind of looking at this from strategic planning about, oh, let's weed out the bad apples and keep the good ones, or let's make sure that we can keep as many people as possible. What has been your take on that? Like, what's the general consensus around how they like to plan their business?
Well, the planning itself is equally a little bit of a fool's game, because we really don't know again what's going to be occurring.
Mhm.
So you've got the short-term forecasting that's going on, which is probably a little bit easier to contemplate, not looking terribly attractive. But then you're looking at, okay, let's look at it for the end of 2021. What are we going to be looking at there? Um, so there is planning underway, but the planning is again still somewhat loose, because we still don't know. As an example, are we going to have international travel? Are the borders going to open? We are a trading country, and we really do depend heavily on folks coming into this country and trade into this country as well. So it's basically a best guess, but I would say this much: I think everybody's being highly conservative.
Yeah.
In other words, they're not going to bear down and incur more expense, and especially on payroll, than they really have to. That would be the common thread.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I also think that in the pandemic, there's been so many things that have come to light that maybe employers or employees don't even realize that it's something that they need to consider, or they need to um, even think about, really. I mean, there's so many things that have changed during the pandemic, and there's so many things that continue to change around us and automate almost with the times. So as an example, taking away from the HR kind of practice for a second, we used to have, taxis and cabs that you would call and they would come to your house, but now we have Uber. Then we used to have cashiers, but now you can self checkout. And then we used to have, you go to a store, you try something on and you can buy it, but now you can order online. And I think that it's an interesting point from an HR perspective, because do you think that the practice of HR is migrating towards that way while people are being conservative about keeping their positions?
Well, I think that's a whole different dimension and a whole additional layer on the very problems that we find. I think it's important to certainly consider where you're the service industry, and what you can automate. Using the checkout in the grocery store is a good example. I'm sure they'd all love to convert all of their cashiers into self-help, and indeed, I'm sure over time it will actually happen. Um, but that's already there with us. So automation itself, artificial intelligence, those are very real issues that we're contending with. We're going to be getting into driverless vehicles. All of that is going to change the landscape. But I think right now the pandemic, probably the most significant thing as far as the workplace is concerned, which in fact touches a little bit on the issue around technology, is that we're going into become more home-based. And I think that the upheaval worldwide as we actually migrate to home-based work is going to be huge. It will impact on everything from property values in the inner cities to the number of vehicles on the road, to how do you compensate somebody at home? Can you pay them less? Or why do we even have the same employee? Why don't we just get somebody in Slovakia who speaks perfect English and do the job that somebody is for a pittance of what you would otherwise pay here? So I think that the automation conversation, the pandemic as it impacts on home-based work, all of these things combined are going to change profoundly the landscape as it relates to employee relations. And oddly enough, I think the part that's going to be the slowest to on the uptick on this is going to be government and legislation, because
Really?
legislation is very much old school. It's archaic. If you think about it for a minute, when we talk about hours of work in a day, when we're all on our cell phones, we're our smartphones, we are doing emails at ridiculous hours, oftentimes for our own convenience. But the fact of the matter is, how are you actually going to establish, which is time-based work in the new world where technology becomes a driver and people are given a lot of latitude as to when they work? It's going to be much more results oriented, as opposed to, well, you haven't put in your hour yet. And then of course wanting to gauge, well, were they productive in that hour when you can't even see them. So there's there's going to be some privacy issues that are going to be around that too as well, because of course employers are going to want to tap into your computer, and they're going to want to see what are you doing with all those keystrokes. Are you looking at Facebook or actually doing some productive work?
Yeah, you touched on a really good point that I really want to talk about a little bit deeper, was is managing people working from home, because I think I think in the world of HR, people think of human resources as like a people manager. But myself and John, we work for HRIR, and well, John actually owns HRIR. I shouldn't say that, but the idea that every manager has to have some facets of human resources capabilities and human resources responsibility. And so when you have a workforce that is working from home and having these access to various tools or whatever information sources that they get, how would you help a manager manage their people?
Well, from an HR perspective, probably the best thing that we do for any manager is to equip them with the tools themselves. In other words, they become the HR manager. As much as we can do that, I think we're doing them a service. So whether it's necessarily educating them or whether we're equipping them, no matter how we approach it, rather than having what could become a little bit of a bottleneck called an HR department where all employee relations decisions have to flow through it, instead open it up so that everybody who has responsibility for overseeing people actually knows what to do, i.e. they understand compliance issues, which means you want to give them information related to the law. So let's give it to them at their fingertips. There are certain types of forms that need to be provided for. Well, why would you have that manager have to create their own form? Why don't you, or why should an HR department do that? Why don't you just give them the form as a template and let them fill in the blanks? So there's so many things that we can do that can actually make managers much more autonomous, yet they are controlled through their budgeting process, and they're controlled from, if you wish, quality assurance audits from time to time, but free them up to be the ones who are responsible for their teams.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's crazy that, HR managers have to manage other people's teams. Every manager should manage their own teams. And as you said, the tools available to them are vast and available, especially while everybody is working from home and being able to go on their computer and find that good data. I want to take a little bit of a left turn and talk a little bit about some of these tools and how they, like, we talked about how they help managers, but how do you think that they provide like almost an insurance policy? So almost like a risk management solution to make sure that if something were to go awry in home-based work, which we will talk about in a second, but like, how do you think these tools will really act as an insurance policy? And do you think they're an insurance policy, or do you think that we're just being overly cautious?
Well, I mean, the whole notion of what we do as being a risk management solution, I think, is very much front and center with what we do. Let's start from the beginning, and that is that if an employer could make money without employees, I would almost guarantee that employer would be glad to do that. Because as much as we declare, depending on where you're coming from, we declare, people are our greatest asset, they also become our greatest liability. And we discover all of a sudden that everyone has their own agenda, what they want to be doing, where they want to be doing it. We have to be constantly wanting to make sure that we're totally in touch with what they're doing. So people themselves, from an employer's point of view, is they prefer not having as many, to be very honest. But because they do have to have them, then it becomes a matter of, okay, well, how do we do it in such a way that we mitigate against possible risk of actually having employees? And that means that the decision making. And remember now, every time a supervisor or manager engages an employee is a moment of truth where if they do it wrong, it could come back and haunt that employer in terms of a wrongful dismissal action, in terms of a human rights complaint, in terms of even employment standards complaint, or worse yet, an occupational health and safety complaint as a harassment issue. So these are the tools, if you wish, that we really want to make sure that managers and supervisors have access to. They understand better what their role is and equip them well as it relates to their ability to manage people. And that, I
Yeah.
think, is number one for risk management.
Oh, 100%. I actually had a story come through my network very recently. He's an employee. He works for a company, a a medium-sized company. He was super happy going to work. He loved going to the office. He loved the culture. He loved all his staff, like everybody. And then the pandemic hit and he started working from home. And he started to realize, the organization had no plan of anybody ever going back to work, no communication about when they're going to go back into the office. No, they virtually didn't do anything, and they're still working from home with no end goal in sight. So this person reached out to their manager and basically said that they're struggling with their mental health and that they are having some issues working from home, and the company virtually didn't do anything. And right as of now, they still work there, but he's demotivated and he's not performing maybe to his best abilities because he feels a little bit jaded. Now, I don't know for a fact, but I can make an educated guess that a lot of people feel like this. But the flip side is the employer, now they're opening up themselves to a whole risk of liabilities. The fact that they don't have an occupational health and safety plan in place. What if an inspector comes and talks to them? Do they even have a joint health and safety committee? What happens if they get fined? What happens if this person ends up getting terminated and they turn around and say, well, I told you that I was struggling and you didn't accommodate me. You didn't take into effect all these things I was saying, and you basically did nothing. So I actually deserve more money now. Then, there's a whole slew of things that open up in response to, a disgruntled or an upset employee that, online tools that employers can access and should access will protect them down the road. And I think that the idea of human resources and the practice of human resources is moving more towards online, like the rest of the world. And I think that, with that being said, being able to access this information, anybody can access the information. Go online and find a job description. Go online and find out how to terminate somebody. But the real crux of the matter is employers need to realize what they need to be compliant for, and they can do that from home, but they need a little bit of help, I think.
Just that example that you were just citing, it reminds me that when you see that an employee has got, a potential mental health issue, especially if they're declaring it to you, as an employer, you actually do have what's called the duty to inquire before you have the duty to accommodate. And that duty to inquire means that you actually have to probe it a little bit deeper, not necessarily wanting to find out, exactly what the issue is, but making sure that you as the employer have done everything in your power. So as an example, as a general principle, what I talk with clients about when it comes to their benefits package, that they've in fact provided for a rider for an EAP. So most insurance companies actually have, as riders attached to the group benefits plan, an EAP program. In my mind, that is a must. There should be no organization that does not have an EAP, particularly at this time. And in fact, that has been, back to what are some of the things that I've been having to deal with. That's actually one of those issues, to make sure that the clients have got an EAP, that people can reach out, because the mental health issues are going to be much more pronounced going forward than even they are right now today. Watch carefully when a massive amount of people are going to be permanently laid off in the next 3 months, right across, frankly, probably across the world, because you cannot sustain an economy when you have basically the demand side of the economy shut down. We're not allowed to operate because we're trying to distance ourselves from each and every one of us. And therefore, business has had to come to a screeching halt. Employers cannot carry on in an unsustained fashion. So you are actually going to see some pretty critical stuff. And, if you are watching this podcast, really make sure that you've got an EAP, especially, in place.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I think that these EAP is just another, not only a tool that you can provide your employees out of goodwill and being a caring employer, but it's also just another risk management tool or insurance policy that you have should something come down the line later. And at
100%.
HRIR, we really try to hone in on that spot. Employers look out for their employees, but they also need to protect themselves. Yeah. So thanks, John. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to me today and give some perspective.
Always a pleasure, Joss.
Always a pleasure. For those of you who are new listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. For our followers, thank you so much for listening as well. We discuss all different types of HR issues, the world, human rights, all that good stuff through our social media channels. So, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. That's HRIR. Thanks so much. Stay healthy and stay safe.